everybody. I'm here today with Chapter 44 of Book 1 of the Ranger's Apprentice, the Early Years series, the tournament at Gorlan, and we're going to go ahead and get into it. There was a shocked buzz of reaction from those assembled, nobles and commoners alike. A royal prince was being charged with treason and threatened with the death penalty. Duncan ignored the mutterings from the crowd and made a dismissive gesture. All of these charges are false, Morgoth. The raids in the north were carried out by an impostor, sent by you to discredit me, while you held me prisoner at Castle Wild River. I held you prisoner, Duncan? I did this? Morgoth said, with a sarcastic smile. You arranged it, Duncan said. Morgoth followed up quickly. And you have proof? Duncan realized he was on shaky ground. The castle was commanded by Sir Aemon of Wild River, a well-known supporter of yours. And Sir Aemon is here to swear to that? To swear that he held you on my orders? Morgoth made a show of looking around, then looking back to Duncan, his hands held wide in a gesture that said, "Show me." Duncan set his jaw and said nothing. Then perhaps, Morgoth continued, in the same mocking tone, you can produce this impostor you say I hired to impersonate you? Is he here to speak up? He was, Duncan said shortly. But he was killed. How very inconsiderate of him, Morgoth said. Several people in the crowd behind the barons tittered. Duncan flushed angrily. And how very inconvenient for you. Duncan decided he should counterattack and try to regain some lost ground by dealing with the one matter where there was concrete proof. The fact remains, he said, addressing the crowd. Morgoth broke the rules of the tournament, the rules of honor, by using a war lance and trying to murder Baron Erold. Sir Rodney, Baron Erold's battlemaster, stepped forward, holding the lance. He had retrieved it from the jousting field. He passed it to Duncan, who held it up for inspection. See? An oak shaft, not pine. And see the iron point? A killing point. He looked at Morgoth. I suppose you concealed this behind clay or plaster, painted to look like a wooden jousting tip? Morgoth pursed his lips and shrugged. I had no knowledge of this, I swear. Obviously, one of my followers took matters into his own hands. But if so, he did it without my approval. I'll find out who did this, and he will be severely punished. You have my word. He had addressed the comment not to Duncan, but to the barons gathered round them. He noted with satisfaction that several of them nodded. Others looked less convinced, but he had sown the seed of doubt that would be vital to his defense. Duncan hefted the oak shaft once or twice. And you're telling us you didn't notice the difference in weight? Again, Morgoth spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. I have all my jousting lances weighted with lead, so that they feel the same as a war lance. You know the saying, practice as you plan to fight. There was a murmur of concurrence from the barons standing around. Morgoth's habit of weighting his lance with lead bands was well known. Morgoth saw Teasel approaching through the crowd, carrying a roll of parchment. He turned to his henchman and beckoned him forward. He sensed that he was gaining the upper hand in this battle of words. This came as no surprise. Duncan was young and inexperienced in matters such as this, and Morgoth knew the prince had no concrete proof of the charges he was laying. He had bluster and indignation and unsubstantial accusations. Given time, of course, he might be able to prove that he had been held captive. But here and now his case was weak, and it was seen to be so. Now was the time for Morgoth to present his most conclusive argument. Behind the crowd of spectators, Morgoth could see files of his soldiers taking up their positions, ready to attack on his command. He estimated that Teasel had managed to assemble approximately 50 men, which would be more than enough for the current situation. Teasel stepped forward and handed him the rolled piece of parchment. Morgoth took it, then leaned close to his assistant and spoke softly. "Go to the castle, kill Oswald, and get rid of the body." Teasel lowered his head in a quick bow. "Yes, my lord." He turned and hurried away through the crowd. Duncan watched him go, and wondered what Morgoth was up to. But Morgoth's next words caused him to forget the hurrying figure. "My lords and people of Erluin, I have a most unpleasant duty to perform here, one which I am reluctant to carry out. But in the light of false accusations against me, tendered without proof or evidence of any kind, I feel I must bring this matter before you." He brandished the rolled parchment above his head. Silence fell over the crowd as they looked at it, wondering what it was. "What trickery are you planning now?" Duncan asked angrily. But several voices from the crowd admonished him. "Let him speak. We'll hear him." "You've said your piece, Duncan. Now let Morgoth speak." Morgoth waited, letting the moment stretch while the interjections grew and more people took up the cry. Duncan noticed that those calling out were barons who favored Morgoth's cause. That was to be expected, he thought. But among the others, those as yet uncommitted, several were nodding their heads in agreement. Defeated, he took half a pace back and gestured for Morgoth to continue. Holding the parchment high, Morgoth allowed it to unroll. The crowd could see it was covered in ornate writing, and a large seal was fixed in red wax at the bottom. "This is a proclamation from King Oswald," he shouted. "In it, the king disinherits Duncan on account of his disloyalty and of his brigandry on the northern border. In his place, the king names me as his heir." Uproar broke out among the crowd. Some protested that the proclamation was false. Others cheered Morgoth's elevation to the position of royal heir. Duncan frowned as he estimated that the differing reactions were about equal. Morgoth handed the parchment to Baron Naylor and raised his voice above the shouting crowd. "Let Baron Naylor read and confirm what I have said," he shouted. The bickering, catcalling, cheering, and protests died away. The crowd waited as Naylor scanned the document. He was an irritatingly slow reader, and his lips moved to frame the words as he read. The crowd waited on tenterhooks. Then he looked up. "It's true," Naylor declared. "King Oswald has disinherited Duncan and named Morgoth as his rightful heir." There was a note of satisfaction in his voice. It was clear where his loyalty lay. Pandemonium broke out, with everyone speaking or shouting at once. Morgoth threw a triumphant glare at Duncan, then raised his hands for silence. Gradually, the noise died away. He took the parchment from Naylor and brandished it, pointing to the large seal on the bottom. "And this proclamation bears King Oswald's royal seal," he shouted triumphantly. He turned from one side to the other, showing them the seal. Then a thin voice broke the silence. "But not my signature." There was a commotion at the rear of the crowd, as three figures pushed their way through to confront Morgoth. Flanking the central figure were Halt and Crowley. The man between them pushed back the cowl on his ragged cloak and revealed his features. Word ran around the crowd in a startled series of exclamations. "The king!" Oswald faced Morgoth, pointing a trembling, accusing finger at the Baron. "The proclamation is a forgery, Morgoth. You took my seal and fixed it there. I would never name you as my successor." "The proclamation is true," Morgoth shouted angrily. "You're simply recanting now that your son is back with a cock-and-bull story about impostors and being held prisoner." "Just as you held me prisoner, Morgoth," accused Oswald. But the tall Baron shook his head violently. "I held you for your own protection," he declared. He pointed at Duncan. "This man, your son," he put a sneering emphasis on the word, "tried to kill you, remember? You were glad enough for my protection then, if you recall." Oswald shook his head doggedly. "I was mistaken." "And now you're not?" Morgoth said sarcastically. "It seems our royal family are continually changing their mind as the situation suits them. One minute Duncan is a brigand and a traitor. Next he's a captive, being held against his will on my orders. And our good king seems to look for my protection one minute, then claim I've taken him prisoner the next." Several voices were raised in agreement. Morgoth's efforts, currying favor among the barons, were bearing fruit. But Duncan stepped forward angrily. This war of words had gone on long enough, and he was amazed at the way Morgoth could sway the sentiment of the crowd. "Arrest him," he said to Crowley. The ranger leader made a gesture, and his 11 companions stepped forward, bows ready, and arrows nocked. At the same moment, Morgoth shouted an order. "Gorlan, to me!" The 50 soldiers Teasel had summoned now shouldered their way through the crowd and stood by their lord. Swords drawn, they faced the grim-visaged line of rangers. "Say the word, Duncan, and we'll start shooting," Crowley said. But the king raised a hand. "No," Oswald said. "Innocent people will be killed if we fight now." Morgoth smiled grimly. He knew he had won this round, and bought himself valuable time. He raised his voice and addressed the king. "I will answer to your charges," he said, "and I'll bring my own against Duncan. But I'll do it before the full council of barons, as is my right." "The king himself has accused you," Duncan shouted angrily. "You'll answer to him." Morgoth eyed his enemy and said, in scathing tones, "The days are long gone when kings could be judge, jury, and executioner," he said. "We have a rule of law here in Araluen now, and that law says I can demand to face the council of my peers." "It'll take months to assemble the full council," Crowley protested. Morgoth allowed himself a bitter smile at the ranger. "And I will await the assembly in my own castle, not in some dungeon at Castle Araluen, where Duncan and his backsliding father can plot my accidental death." "You'll surrender yourself to me now," said the king, his face white with fury. But Morgoth shook his head. "As I've said, I'll wait until the council summons in Castle Gorlan," he said. He turned to the commander of his force. "Captain, we're going back to the castle." "Yes, sir," the captain snapped, saluting. Then he turned to his men. "Form a phalanx around the Baron, men," he said. "Prepare to withdraw and force." Morgoth's soldiers had been well drilled. Quickly, they formed a protective circle around him, with all of them facing outward, swords drawn, and ready to meet an attack from any direction. Slowly, they began to withdraw toward the castle, shoving aside any who were slow to move out of their way. Duncan watched, frustration mounting, as the group withdrew in a shuffling gait, designed to maintain their formation and conform to the slowest among them, those moving backward. "Can't we stop them?" he said furiously. The others shook their heads. Morgoth was on his home ground, with all of his soldiers, men-at-arms, and knights at his disposal. That totaled over 100 men, a well-organized force trained to act together. None of the other barons had brought a full retinue to the tournament. Errold had the largest group, and that amounted to less than 20 men. Given time, they could probably muster a force of around 100 men. But right now, they didn't have time. Morgoth was in control of the situation. In addition, there was a strong possibility that a good number of the barons, sympathetic to Morgoth's cause, would refuse to lend men to fight him. "We can contain them," Pritchard said. "We can muster enough men to bottle them up, but not enough to storm the castle. By the same token, he doesn't have enough men to fight his way out." "So it's a stalemate?" Crowley said. Pritchard nodded. "Until the council has assembled, that's the situation. We can't get in. He can't get out." Halt watched the shuffling mass of soldiers as they moved in a steel-bristling formation toward the castle. He could see the tall figure of Morgoth in the center, standing head and shoulders above his men. Acting on an impulse, he unslung his bow from his shoulder and began to move toward the exit to the tournament ground. Duncan caught up with him and stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Where are you going?" he said. The Hibernian faced him grimly. "I'm going to put an arrow through that black-hearted swine and finish this once and for all." But Duncan shook his head. "That'll be murder," he said. "I won't have it done on my account or my father's. We'll leave Morgoth to the council." Halt dropped his gaze, knowing Duncan was right. "Even so," he said, "I can't help thinking we're making a big mistake." All right, that's going to bring us to the end of chapter number 44. As always, I want to thank you all for joining me today, and thank you for listening. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time in chapter 45. God bless, and have a good one.